Hello, everyone. You were saying, say a little bit more about yourself. Well, I'm just going to say they're all boring affiliations. So I'm currently lecturing in social science at Bournemouth University. And I'm here to talk about an academic article that I've just published on the detrimental impact of queer theory and politics at universities and beyond. And before I go on, I have a note, talk about gender, because in the previous session, we've been talking about the need to stop using the word gender. I agree. Sex roles and stereotypes works. Other terms work. And I talk about the very problematic origins of the term gender. And I also explore the shift from women's studies to gender studies. But that's not what I'm going to talk about today, but I just wanted to make that note. And also, I will be using gender in this presentation, but in terms of it's an object of inquiry, and I'm using it when others use it. I hope that becomes clear. So in this paper, I'm very much thinking with the concept of Academentia, which was coined by Mary Daly, but entered my research through a participant in a way and at a point of my research that felt especially meaningful. Does anybody know or who this participant is or might be? Let's keep the mystery going for a little longer. So I am a sociologist, and in 2021, I was researching the disputes around sex and gender. As part of this, I was conducting interviews with feminist academics, and one of them described herself in the consent form as an exited survivor of Academentia. Any clues? Any clues? No? It was Dr. Julia Long, who I was interviewing in part to ask about an academic event on feminist dilemmas and feminist hope, that was the title, where she was removed after noting how, despite all the talk about anti-feminist backlash at the event, there had been no mention of the phenomenon of men pretending to be women and taking over feminism. You can read about the event in the paper, including the experience of her companion that day, Professor Sheila Jeffries, who I also interviewed, in addition to the views of those supportive of the abuse that followed. So, for example, one interviewee with a role at the event told me, "It was fascinating to watch. Almost the entire room just turned on this person. It was fascinating to see," she clarified, "in the sense that a clear message was sent. You don't belong here anymore." I had no trouble excluding them, one journal editor told me. In her opinion, universities are not democratic spaces. In our interview, Julia described this incident as a rare moment of clarity about the level of delusion and anti-feminism in academia today. So, exited survivor of Academentia, indeed. And of course, its power to capture what I was documenting with my research went much beyond this particular incident. It was reflective of what I was beginning to think of as nothing short of an exodus of feminist academics from what we now call gender studies, but also to growing extent academia as a whole, due to an environment where voicing your views would lead to a long list of repercussions that include threats of violence. And here you have a list of experiences, personal experiences by my feminist interviewees. Julia's phrase also evoked the ways in which those interviewees who positioned themselves as middle ground, somewhere in the middle, were censoring themselves around this topic, and even pulling back altogether from everyday activities like teaching, research, being a journal editor, when it came to the study of sexuality and gender, because they did not feel safe or because they did not want to be associated with, quote, scholarship that is thought police. And then we have the group of academics supportive of what I call genderism. I hear that don't like the term. I don't know why. It's pretty neutral, descriptive anyway, who struggled to provide answers to my questions, even when it came to their own definitions of sex and gender. And even as they were actively participating in promoting this ideology, as well as in silencing their dissenting colleagues. Some admitted not having clarity of thought. What is more, a journal editor told me that as a post-structuralist, she doesn't understand any of the words she uses. We need to take that in. So other academics considered the intellectual approach as harmful. So again, an intellectual approach to the study or to the discussions around sex and gender was harmful. And in general, it was made clear to me that when it comes to transgender, for them, it is a matter of politics and of towing the party line. Yeah, and here you can see this, a direct quote. And little did I know how closely Julia's phrase would resonate a year later when I published a summary of my interview findings. I was subjected to vicious backlash online, even from academics, and including a trans-identifying colleague, accusing me of aiming to cause harm and calling for me to be censored and worse. Things escalated to the extent that some months later, I found myself raising funds to bring to an employment tribunal claims of discrimination, whistleblower detriment, and unfair dismissal. So, as this media piece notes, views on sex and gender, absolutely. But there is a lot more that is being silenced at universities that matters to feminist academics. And of course, we have been discussing that already, but let me go back to my interviews. So this academic was frustrated by the difficulty of discussing the materiality of women's bodies, including motherhood, noting that if she tried to do so, she would be accused of being transphobic. Others were concerned that the push to replace sex with the concept of gender identity in data collection would lead to poor research. And moreover, result in situations where we can't support women due to a lack of data about the issues that affect them and so on. And the suppression of dissent on transgender, as it's been pointed out by other speakers during the conference, is linked to the suppression of the feminist critique of sexual and reproductive exploitation. And here we can find the triad of slurs, TERF, SWERF, and more recently, SERF. That's by a queer US academic from, I think it's 2017. Instead, in academia, what dominates is the queer embrace of these practices, including others like pornography. And as this paper here explains, both queer studies and porn studies, it is an established field of study, porn studies, have an unabashed interest in perversion, and both emerged in dissent to second-wave feminism. So this is reflective of what radical feminists have been saying about the university as the engine room of the ideologies of male dominance. That must ring a bell, because you can't see the slide, but I'm quoting you. That's you. And with regard to the situation in recent years, as a patriarchal anti-women backlash. That was Julia during the interview. I agree with this, but I also feel that there is more. And I certainly had the sense that there was more thinking to be done with the concept of Academentia in relation to the queering of universities. So to dig deeper into that strand from the Gender Wars project, I went back to the academic and activist literature. I would like to briefly introduce what I found. So, as well as the attack on women, I believe that there are two key issues here. and these are interrelated. One, the assault on childhood. Two, the assault on sanity. As regards the assault on childhood, we can see a double movement. On the one hand, there are attempts to reframe a sexual abuse of children as a queer sexual orientation. This is present from the start. We can see it in some of the seminal queer texts. But it is also the logical conclusion of its very definition. Here is one. Queer is anyone who is or feels marginalized because of his or her sexual practices. And here we have a contemporary example of an academic paper on queer criminology where the authors state, minor attraction is a sexual orientation. Minor attracted persons are like other folks with non-normative sexual identities, and they are a queer population. This is a peer-reviewed published paper. At the same time, we have the queering of childhood, and this effort can be seen in academia, notably, and I'm quoting, in recent attempts to meld the fields of childhood studies and queer studies. The queer academic literature also explains how the queering of childhood involves disrupting the binary child-adult, rejecting well-established theories of childhood development, contesting the so-called discourses that children are innocent and in need of protection, that caution must be exercised in exposing them to the subversive. Again, these are all quotes from the literature. In contrast, we find a push for things like a camp curriculum and drag pedagogy from early childhood education as a model for learning how to live queerly. And this includes moving children away from the family. Also central to the queering of childhood is the push for bodily autonomy, narrative we are, of course, familiar with when it comes to transgender. And here we have a quote openly explaining that, quote, queerness names the side of those not fighting for the children. And another one rejecting the defense of children as well as women, it's the colonialist position, which is another constant thread. See, if this wasn't enough, also considered colonial is the very defense of sanity. So let me introduce mad studies. An emergent field pioneered by mad people within academia in defense of madness, and which is increasingly being taken up within universities, often within existing departments. One central aspect of this activist scholarship is challenging, and I'm quoting again, sane supremacy, sanist prejudices, and epistemic violence and injustice against psychic diversity, all of which are seen as colonial violence. Mad scholars are against the sane centricity of higher education institutions and want to dismantle the university space as a sphere of expert knowledge. That's all very bad. Another aim is to produce the unlearning of students who are also expected to educate themselves, again, familiar language, educate themselves about the same privilege. Right, I want to highlight how these attempts to mudden established knowledge and practice appear to pay particular attention to childhood. One example is this academic paper by a queer, mad, neurodivergent, non-binary scholar who argues against developmental psychology and safeguarding procedures, and instead calls for the maddening early childhood education and care. In this paper, there is a section called Results or whatever you want to call it, featuring autobiographical poetic writing. Here are some extracts. When I walk in the room, madness walks in with me. I forgot to take my Ritalin. I can't focus. They is me, I am they. Remember my pronouns. Transgender identifications of academics in math studies were frequent, and this points to the link between the trans and mad movements. We can also see this link in the very similar language, in how they both push for depathologization across the board, and in how they both consider their political subjects as victims of European colonialism. And of course, they're both influenced by queer theory and politics. And it is precisely the, quote, mutually constitutive character of madness, queerness, and transness that leads the academic book chapter called Reclaiming the Lunatic Fringe to call for more scholars to use a mad, queer, trans lens. So one example of the explicit merging of the trans and mad movements would be the gender identity labels under the umbrella neurogender. And here are all the flags, because you must have flags. Right, so here we have some examples for people with borderline personality disorder, depression, or schizophrenia. Voice hearing, voice hearers. They talk in math studies, they talk a lot about voice hearers and, you know, the epistemic violence, so all of that against voice hearers. So the mad and trans movements also come together in a new movement for those who experience themselves as plural, as Meg John Barker explains. Barker was a senior lecturer at the Open University and identifies as mad, queer, non-binary, and plural. She has been hugely influential. And this includes writing the British Association for Counselling and Psychotherapy Guide for Good Practice across the counselling professions on gender, sexual, and relationship diversity. Barker explains that in addition to gender, plural people often have selves of different ages. And Plurality resource tells us that those who change age back and forth are called age sliders. It also explains that plural additionally includes those who, and here we go, those who identify as species other than human, like dragons, elves, or species from space. I'm trying to keep a serious face here. Barker is open about how the plurality movement is part of the queer endeavor and how it overlaps with transgender. It's a system of 7 people. Barker hears all their voices and even publishes writing consisting of conversations between them. As I say in my paper, I dread to think how university policies would adapt to appease the mad movement or a cohort of plural identifying students and staff. Right, so that's all I have time for today. But if you're interested, my paper is open access. It's online. Here are the contents I was mentioning before. Well, I talk about the sex wars and shifts in academia from women's studies to gender studies is part of that. And I would just like to say that this paper was published as part of a special issue in a Spanish feminist journal. And I want to express my admiration for my colleagues there because the climate is particularly hostile. As one of them said, they're breaking the trans law on a daily basis simply by voicing their feminist views. Nonetheless, they persist. And I also just want to end by acknowledging how I was especially inspired by Sheila Jeffries and Julia Long. Thank you.